Hello, and thank you for joining me. My name is Dr. Sharon Scambury, and I'm here today to talk about international business. We're working from the Charles Hill textbook 2021, and today we're focused on Chapter 15. Chapter 15 is all about entering foreign markets and the strategic decisions associated with that action. So let's share the screen here and we'll get going. So, entering developed and emerging markets is the title of this chapter. And the specific learning objectives are the explaining the basic decisions that firms make when they decide to undertake a foreign expansion. And these three basic decisions are which markets to enter, when to enter those markets, and on what scale. We're also going to compare the different modes that firms use to enter foreign markets and identify the factors in the decisions related to entry mode. We'll look at the advantages and disadvantages of acquisitions versus greenfield ventures with regards to market entry, and we'll also look at advantages and disadvantages of strategic alliances. All right. So here we go. All right. So when international firms decide to expand internationally, they have to decide which foreign markets they're going to enter, when to enter, and on what scale. They also need to consider the entry mode, the strategy that they're going to use, in other words, and there will need to be consideration of what strategic alliances they're going to make, if any. Okay, so strategic alliances include cross-shareholding deals, licensing, joint ventures, and more informal cooperative arrangements. Let's start with basic entry decisions, such as which foreign markets to enter. So what we do is we assess long-term profit potential of each market. We do this by looking at the size of the market, the present and likely future wealth of the consumers within that market, and the costs and risks associated with being involved in that market. So the value an international business can create in a foreign market depends on the suitability of what they have to offer to relative to that market and the nature of the competition that's within that market. Now, another basic entry decision with regards to international business and foreign market expansion is the timing of entry. You might think that you want to be a first mover and gain all the advantages of being a first mover, but there's actually some disadvantages in being a first mover. Let's look at the advantages first. When you're a first mover, moving into a foreign market, you're going to preempt the rivals, you're going to capture that initial demand and establish a strong brand name. You're going to build sales volume in that country and ride down the experience curve ahead of the competition. You're also going to create switching costs that keep the consumers in your market share rather than someone else's. But I mentioned that there's disadvantages. So the disadvantages include having to devote considerable effort, time, and expense to learning this market because it hasn't been done before. If you're a first mover, then this is new territory. So you're increasing the risk and the costs of business failure in being a first mover. There's also costs of promoting and establishing your offer, and that includes the cost of educating the customers with regards what it is that you're offering. And regulations change, and they may change in a way that diminishes the value of early entrant investment. With regards to scale of entry decisions, there must be a strategic commitment that has long-term impact. And this is difficult to reverse. So rapid, large-scale market entry can have an important influence on the nature of competition in that market, but it must be balanced against the resulting risks and lack of flexibility that are associated with significant commitment. Small-scale entry, however, allows a firm to learn about a foreign market while limiting exposure to that market. So in summary, we can say that there's no right decisions. It depends on the risks and rewards. And businesses based in developing nations also have to enter foreign markets if they seek to become global players. All right, so this graphic is showing us that when the level of investment and commitment increases, you're probably looking at increased risk, but potentially also increased returns. Okay, let's talk about exporting. Right, so here we've got direct exporting and indirect exporting. Let's talk about exporting in general. So what we're talking about with regards to exporting is the sale of your product that's produced in one country and you're selling it to residents of another country. So you're exporting it from one country to another. And it's not as simple as that, as this graphic is showing us here. There's complicated steps in between to make this happen. But it's a midway risk return strategy, this idea of exporting. But there's specific advantages and disadvantages involved that we need to be aware of. So exporting avoids the substantial costs of establishing manufacturing operation in a host country. So that's a good idea. And it may help your organization achieve experience curve and location economies as well. But there's disadvantages. Disadvantages of exporting include that it may not be appropriate if lower cost locations for manufacturing the product can be found in certain markets. There's also high transportation costs that can make exporting uneconomical, and that's particularly the case for bulk products. Maybe there's tariff barriers that can make exporting uneconomical. And another disadvantage of exporting is that local agents for marketing, sales, and service, they're not necessarily going to be as devoted as you to your product. Another option that we can consider is turnkey projects. And an advantage of a turnkey project is that this can earn great economic returns, and it can be less risky than foreign direct investment. So if we back up a step, turnkey projects are when you have called for a contractor to establish, for example, a manufacturing plant for your organization or your product in a foreign country. So you're employing or contracting another organization to develop the project in the foreign market, and then they hand you the key for a fee. Now, the disadvantage of turnkey projects is that the firm will have no long-term interest in the foreign country. So you're selling a technology through turnkey project is also selling competitive advantage to potential or actual competitors. Another option here is licensing. Licensing grants the rights to intangible intellectual property to another entity. And licensing includes the use of patents, the licensing of inventions or formulas, maybe processes or designs, maybe even copyrights and trademarks. So advantages of licensing: no development costs and risk associated with entering a foreign market. It can be used when a firm wishes to participate in a foreign market but is prohibited from doing so by barriers to investment. So it gives you another option in that regard. And it's licensing is used when a firm processes some intangible property that might have business applications, but it doesn't want to develop those applications themselves. So you license out the technology or the intellectual property instead. The disadvantages of licensing include that it does not give the firm tight control over the manufacturing, marketing, and strategy that is required to realise the experience curve and the location economies. So you lose control. It limits the firm's ability to coordinate strategic moves across countries by using profits earned in one country to support competitive attacks in another. And the risk associated with licensing technology know-how to foreign organisations is another potential disadvantage. Okay, franchising is another mode of entry to consider when you're seeking to enter foreign markets. So here what we're talking about is that the franchisor sells the intangible intellectual property, for example, a trademark, to a franchisee. And there's an agreement that includes strict rules on how business is conducted in using that trademark, for example. So the advantages of franchising is that the firm experiences lower costs and risks than when they might move into a foreign market on their own. And another advantage is that it builds global presence quite quickly. But the disadvantage is that it may inhibit the firm's ability to take profits out of one country to support competitive attacks in another. And of course, the loss of control over the quality. Okay. Okay, joint ventures are another mode of entry into a foreign market. And joint ventures are about cooperative undertaking between two or sometimes more organisations, and typically 50-50 ventures are most common. Advantages of joint ventures are that local partners' knowledge of the host country's competitive conditions, their culture, their language, their political systems, their business ways. You're tapping into that local partner's knowledge. So there's shared costs and there's shared risks associated with joint ventures. There's also political considerations. So a local partner can help you better navigate the political systems in a host country. But the disadvantages of the joint venture is that there will be loss of technology control. There will also be lack of control over subsidiaries that it might need to realise experience curves and local economies. And it can lead to conflicts and battles for control between the investing firms if the goals and objectives change, or if they take different views as to what the strategy can be. So we can end up in a conflict situation. Now, the most riskiest and the most expensive option for entry mode into a foreign market is a wholly owned subsidiary. So this is when we're talking about the firm owns 100% of the subsidiary. There's two ways to go about this: a greenfield venture, where you're setting up an entirely new operation in the host country, or you can acquire an established firm in the host nation using acquisition strategy. Okay, so currently foreign direct investment flows to developing economies decreased by 12% to an estimated $616 billion. This is current figures. And that accounted for 72% of global foreign direct investment. And the report that is provided as a hyperlink here put out recently says that that is the highest share on record. So what we're talking about then is that 72% of global foreign direct investment is going into developing economies. That gives you, that's an indicator of where the future is. All right, advantages of wholly owned subsidiaries. reduces the risk of losing control over the technology, tightly controls operations in different countries, allows your organization to achieve local and experience curve economies, and you hold 100% of the profits. But the disadvantages is that you're bearing the full cost and the full risk of this direct investment. And there's cultural considerations here. If you don't have high cultural competency, then you may well find yourself in trouble. And if you're not partnering with any local organizations, then that's where that risk is highest. All right. Now, when we're looking to identify which entry mode is the best option for your particular organization and that particular market that you're looking to enter, you have to look at the core competencies of the organization that you're operating within. And that means considering technological know-how as well as management know-how. And I would add to that cultural competency. Can you hear my emphasis on cultural competency? We also need to consider pressures for cost reductions and the entry mode. So the greater the pressures for cost reductions, the more likely the firm will want to pursue some combination of exporting and wholly owned subsidiaries. Wholly owned marketing subsidiaries give the organisation tight control, and that might be required for coordinating a globally dispersed value chain. Pressures for cost reductions also gives the firm the ability to use profits generated in one market to improve competitive position in another market. Right. So table 15.1 is a summary of what we've just talked about, the various entry modes and the advantages and disadvantages of each of those entry modes, including exporting, turnkey contracts, licensing, franchising, joint ventures, and wholly owned subsidiaries. So now let's shift to talking about engaging in a greenfield venture or acquisition. So acquisitions are a good idea because they're quick, relatively quick to execute, and acquiring an established operation that might help you be more competitive and preempt competitor action. And so acquisitions actually might be less risky than a greenfield venture when you're starting from scratch, basically. But unfortunately, acquisitions often produce disappointing results. And why is that? Well, you know, maybe you're paying too much, so there might be an overestimation as to what the organization that you're acquiring is worth or potentially worth. There can be a culture clash when you're bringing these two organizations together, it might be that integration of the operations is where you strike the most problems. So it comes down to the degree and the quality of the screening that goes on, and that's not necessarily easy to do, and that's why people or managers or executives with expertise in acquisitions are so highly paid. So we pay such experts on acquisition because they know how to reduce the risk of failure. They know how to conduct detailed audits of operations, financial position, and organizational culture. They know how to reduce unwanted management attrition. So in other words, we want to keep the internal expertise that we've got in such a strategically fragile time. And they know how to integrate bringing an acquired firm in quickly. Other than an acquisition, a wholly owned subsidiary can also be a greenfield venture. And this is where the firm has much greater ability to build the kind of organisation, operation that your organisation wants. Now, of course, because you're establishing an entirely new operation from scratch in a foreign country, it's kind of slow and expensive and therefore more risky. But you can preempt more aggressive global competitors in taking on a greenfield venture. Okay, so when do we acquire and when do we go the greenfield route? Well, acquisitions are a good idea when the firm is seeking to enter a market where there are already well-established competitors, and global competitors are also interested in establishing a presence, right? So acquisition is the relatively quick and easy option. It's better to go with a greenfield venture when there are little to no competitors that you can snap up, and it's a good idea to go greenfield when the competitive advantage of your organization is based on the transfer of embedded competencies, skills, routines, and culture within your organization, right? So, because that's not easily replicated. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about strategic alliances now. So we have specific advantages of strategic alliances. Strategic alliances will facilitate entry into a foreign market because they allow firms to share the fixed costs of developing new products and processes in a foreign land. If they bring together complementary skills, maybe complementary assets. And maybe that's important because maybe your organization nor the strategic partner could do that on their own. So strategic alliances can help establish technological standards for the industry that will benefit the alliance. The disadvantages is that it may give competitors a low-cost route to new technology and markets, and it may generate short-term profits, but sort of less advantages in the longer term. So how do we make alliances work? Well, partner selection is at the top of the list in terms of priorities and considerations here. A good partner helps the firm achieve its strategic goals and has capabilities that the firm lacks. A good partner is unlikely to try to opportunistically exploit the partner organization. So we want to choose a strategic partner and by doing our homework, by collecting as much information as we possibly can. And that includes what's publicly available, but also what we can dig up from informed third parties. We want to get to know this potential strategic alliance as well as possible before we commit. There's also an important consideration as to how the strategic alliance will be structured. So ideally, we want to reduce the risk of giving away too much to the partner. We want contractual safeguards in place. We want to agree in advance to swap skills and technologies that ensures that this is a mutually beneficial relationship. So cross-licensing agreements, for example, might be part of the structure of the alliance. So we want to get significant, credible commitment from the partner in advance. In managing the alliance, we definitely want to be sensitive to cultural differences. We want to build trust and relational capital, and we want to learn from our strategic partners so that we apply the knowledge throughout the organisation. And there you go. That is the end of chapter 15. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you again soon.